fifth graders, it's Mrs. Tremblay. Today we're going to look at how to add and subtract fractions, and we're going to start off with looking at fractions with like denominators and move into fractions with unlike denominators. So let's begin. Our first example is 3/8 plus 2/8. And if you'll notice, I took this rectangle and I divided it up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 equal sized pieces because I see the denominator is 8. So if I wanted to show 3/8 plus 2/8, well, 3/8 would mean 3 of the squares would be shaded. And if I wanted to add 2/8 to that, that would mean I need to shade 2 more because these are still eighths. And to find my final answer, let's see how many pieces I have shaded. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces out of 8. Our numerator is still the number of pieces that we're counting, and denominators, how many pieces the whole is divided up into. Looking at subtraction, same idea here. I have 4/5 minus 2/5, so notice I took this rectangle and I divided it up into 5 equal sized pieces. And if I have 4/5 minus 2/5, if we're subtracting, 4/5 is what I start with. So I'm going to go ahead and place 4/5 on here. And if I subtract 2/5, that means I want to take 2 away, 2/5 away. So here is 1/5 being removed. Here's another 5th being removed. And when you subtract, you're going to tell me what's left. Well, in looking at this, I see that I have 2 shaded pieces out of the 5. So again, the numerator is the number of pieces that we are counting. The denominator is how many pieces it's broken up into. So basically, I'm hoping what you're saying is when you are adding or subtracting fractions with like denominators, all you really need to do is add the number of pieces that you have, which is the numerator. 3 plus 2 is 5. And what it's divided up into, the denominator, the number of pieces, stays the same. 3 plus 2 is 5/8. And same with subtraction. If my denominator is the same, I can say, well, I have 4 out of 5 pieces. I'm going to take 2 of those pieces away. 4 minus 2 is 2. And my denominator stays the same. So you should look when you are asked to add or subtract fractions, hey, do I have like denominators? Because if they are, all you have to do is add your numerators or subtract your numerators. The denominator does not change because the denominator is not pieces that we're counting, it's how many pieces the whole is broken up into. When you have unlike denominators, that is a little bit different. So here I have 1/4 plus 1/2. And I feel like seeing this as a picture really helps you to understand that I can't just add and say, well, I have 2/6. I don't, and this picture will prove it. If we have 1/4 plus 1/2, this right here I broke up into 4 pieces, and this is 1/4. Now to that I want to add 1/2, so I took the same size whole, but I broke it up into 2 pieces, shading one of those. So if I wanted to add those 2 together, it would look like this, right? This is not 2/6. It's not. So when we look at this picture, my numerator is supposed to be the number of pieces I'm counting, and the denominator is the number of same size pieces the whole is broken up into. This whole currently is not broken up into the same size pieces, but I can do that by drawing a line right here. Now I can see that I have 4 of the same size pieces, which is my denominator, and the number of pieces that are shaded would be 3/4. So that means that 1/4 plus 1/2 is 3/4. Now you could draw a picture for each one of these problems below, but you could also use what we learned about finding a common denominator to compare fractions that we did in lesson 3. When you are adding fractions with unlike denominators, all you need to do is change them to have a common denominator, and you can add like we did above. And I'll show you. In the last lesson, if I asked you to compare 1/4 and 1/2, well, you could have used your unit fractions and saw, well, 1/2 is greater. You could also have given them common denominators to compare. So let's try that. When I look at 1/4 and 1/2, I know that I can multiply 2 by something to get 4, right? I can multiply 2 by 2. So if I multiply 2 by 2 to get 4, whatever I do to my denominator, I have to also do to the numerator so that I have an equivalent fraction. So 1/2 is really equal to 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2/4. So I could really look at this problem as a 1/4 plus 2/4. And we saw above that if I'm adding the same denominator, I can just add the pieces that I have. 1 plus 2 is 3, and my denominator stays the same. So I would recommend that you use the strategies that we used in lesson 3 to change your fractions to have common denominators, and then all you have to do is add your numerators and bring over your denominator. The same works for subtraction. You can subtract fractions with common denominators. So let's try a couple. I'm going to put all 4 of these on the screen. And if you wanted to, you could write these down. You could pause it in between and try these on your own, or you could watch A with me and then try B on your own, and watch C with me and then try D on your own, or you can watch all of the examples with me, whatever works best for you. So in looking at this first example, A, I notice that those denominators are not common denominators, so I can't just add like usual because the pieces aren't the same size. So I need to make sure that I have a common denominator before I start adding. When I look at this one, I notice that 5 is a factor of 10. I can multiply 5 by something to get 10. So I'm going to change this 1/5 into tenths. And I can do that by multiplying it by 2 over 2. Remember, that's the same thing as multiplying by 1. 2 over 2 equals 1. But when I multiply 5 by 2, I'll get the 10, and 1 times 2 is 2. So instead of doing 7/10 plus 1/5, I can do 7/10 plus 2/10. Now that my denominators are the same, we can picture it. If I shade 10 or 7 out of 10 pieces, and then I shade another 2 of those pieces, I would now have 7 plus 2 is 9/10 shaded. All right, the next one, I have 3/8 and 2/5. That's not a common denominator. I notice that I can't multiply 5 by something to get 8. So we learned before that I could go ahead and I can multiply 2/5 by the opposite fraction's denominator over itself. And I can multiply 3/8 by the opposite fraction's denominator over itself. This is just like in the last lesson when you learn how to compare fractions, except instead of comparing them in the end, we're adding them together. So this new fraction here would be 5 times 3 is 15/40. And this fraction here, 8 times 2 is 16/40. Now you can kind of picture this. If I have 15 out of 40 pieces shaded, and then I shade another 16 pieces, I would have a total of 31 out of 40 pieces shaded. And that's my final answer. All right, the same works for subtraction. I have 1/2 minus 1/5. Now, if you have a half, it's really difficult to take 1/5 away visually, right? But we learned that you can come up with a common denominator between the two, and then it makes it quite easy to subtract. So I can't multiply 2 by something to get 5, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply 1/2 by the opposite fraction's denominator over itself, and I'm going to multiply 1/5 by the opposite fraction's denominator over itself. So 1/2 is equal to 5/10. 5 times 1 is 5. 5 times 2 is 10. And here, 1/5 is equal to 1 times 2 is 2, and 5 times 2 is 10. So 5/10 and 2/10, those both have the same denominator. Now, super easy to subtract. If you have 5 out of 10 pieces, and you take 2 of those pieces away, we would now be left with 3/10. So we're just subtracting those numerators, and the number of pieces that the whole is divided up into doesn't change. All right, last one, 1/3 minus 2/9. Those are not the same denominator. I do notice that 3 is a factor of 9 though. I can multiply 3 by something to get 9. So I only need to change one of these fractions. I'm gonna change it by multiplying the top and bottom both by 3. So 3 times 1 is 3. 3 times 3 is 9. 1/3 and 3/9 are equivalent. The beauty of this now, if I have 3/9 and I take 2/9 away, it's the same denominator. So if I have 3 pieces and I take 2 of those pieces away, I now have 1 out of 9 pieces left. All set. Good luck on your Go Formative. I miss you guys.